Welcome. Hello. Hi. On behalf of the Department of Social Work and Sociology and the Office of Multicultural Affairs, I'd like to welcome you to Still Learning from the Outsider Within, Black Women in the 21st Century Academy, presented by Dr. JeffriAnne Wilder. Dr. Wilder currently works as a senior research scientist for the National Center for Women and Information Technology. As a member of the social science team, she works directly with the K-12 Alliance to create research-driven resources that will equip and empower its members with tools to increase women and girls' participation in computing and technology. Dr. Wilder holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Florida. In addition to her studies in sociology, Wilder also completed a PhD concentration in women's and gender studies. She completed a master's degree in sociology from Cleveland State University and a bachelor's degree from Allegheny College. Prior to joining NCWIT, Wilder worked for 10 years at the University of North Florida as a tenured associate professor of sociology and the founding director of the Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnic Relations. As an advocate for social justice, she is the recipient of many research, teaching, and leadership awards, and her work has been published in an array of academic journals and publications. She is very passionate about connecting sociology to the everyday issues occurring within our society, especially issues that impact women, girls, and communities of color. This lecture is a significant way for us to recognize Black History Month because she will be discussing issues surrounding race relations, women's empowerment, and higher education. Today, February 20th, also marks the United Nations World Day of Social Justice, a day intended to promote development and human dignity. According to the UN, quote, "We advance social justice when we remove barriers that people face because of gender, age, race, ethnicity, religion, culture, or disability." Dr. JeffriAnne Wilder is an accomplished sociologist, a highly successful Black female professional, and an informed, passionate advocate for social justice. At the end of Dr. Wilder's remarks, we will open the floor for questions from the audience. For your information, the event today is being live streamed and recorded for Concord University's social media pages. You'll be able to access the recording on the Concord University YouTube channel soon. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Wilder.
Well, thank you, everyone. Good afternoon, and it's such a pleasure to be joining you virtually. I have to rub it in. I am in Florida, and it is such a pleasure to be joining you from here as opposed to be sitting in the room with you. So thank you so much for having me. I'm very honored to be a part of today's event. I love talking about the work that I do, but it really is an honor being able to talk about this work during Black History Month. Before I begin my remarks this afternoon, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the University President and her leadership, the Office of Multicultural Affairs, the Department of Social Work and Sociology, and also I'd like to take a moment to recognize the wonderful group of students I had a chance to engage with earlier before my talk began. And I'd like to send a very special thank you to my fellow Gator, Dr. Katie Nutter-Pridgeon, for inviting me to speak today and for encouraging me to share my story. So I'm going to start sharing my screen here with you. And so please someone let me know if at any moment either you cannot hear me or you cannot see my presentation. as Dr. Nutter mentioned, the topic of my talk today is still learning from the outsider within Black women in the 21st century, Black women in the 21st century academy. And so here's our agenda. My talk today is going to be divided into essentially 3 parts. I'll begin by sharing with you my professional background, and then moving into in a really exciting topic around the decade of the Black woman, and I'll explain in a moment what that means. And then I'll move into the space of higher education and looking at the decade of the Black woman within the context of Black women within higher education, and looking at their specific experiences within the 21st century academy. So this, of course, is a word cloud full of many buzzwords around difference in the 21st century. We see words here like multiculturalism, inclusion, diversity, community, perspective, compassion, discussion, uncomfortable, dialogue. And many of these words, I think, adequately describe all of the things and concepts connected to learning about diversity, equity, and inclusion today. These words also accurately describe my career experience over the past 20 years. So as Dr. Nutter-Pridgen mentioned when she was offering up my bio at the beginning of this talk, I am a sociologist, and I readily identify as well as a Black feminist scholar. I've spent 20 years really looking at exploring various aspects of diversity and inclusion in my career, whether that's through my time as a faculty member or through my time spent within various parts of higher education and also other areas of nonprofit. I spent 10 years as a faculty member in the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Social Work at the University of North Florida in Jacksonville. And when I left in 2018, I was an tenured associate professor of sociology there, where I taught regularly courses related to race, gender, diversity, and also was the founding director of the Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnic Relations. At the time, and I believe still currently today, the Institute was the first and the only research-based institute devoted to aspects of race, equity, and inclusion in the state university system of Florida, which encompasses just over a dozen universities. I currently work for NCWIT, which stands for the National Center for Women in Information Technology. I work as a senior research scientist. And even here at NCWIT, I spend most of my days involved in national inclusion initiatives aimed at broadening the participation of women and girls in computing. So as you can see, a lot of the work that I could do, most of my teaching, my research, scholarship, and more importantly, who I am as a person, really revolve around many of these really important words. I'd like to also take a moment to tell you about my embodied core values, who I am as a Black feminist scholar. At the core of who I am lies what I consider to be her stories, where I think about my personal experiences not just as something personally unique to me, but I use my personal experiences as a platform for political transformation and also change agency. At the core of that branches out, has really stood as a nexus to all the variety of things within diversity, equity, inclusion that I have been interested in within higher education over the past 20 years. I won't mention all of these here, as you can see them listed on the slide, but some of my embodied core values, the things that I value as a scholar, the things I value as a sociologist, include a quest for knowledge. Earlier today, with a small group of students, we were talking about, how I first got involved in sociology, or first got involved in my research on colorism. And a lot of times, a lot of my experience has been a reaction to when someone has told me no, and pursuing things that I did not understand. And so my core values include really activating my sociological curiosity or my sociological imagination, which is of course what C. Brett Mills offered us. I really embody innovation and creativity, activism. I wholeheartedly believe in interdisciplinarity, social justice, activism, public sociology and engagement, and of course, community building and collaboration. As a Black feminist scholar, I also embody and look at the lens through which I approach my work through the lens of intersectionality. So exploring the ways in which how our multiple social identities converge to create a distinctive experience for individuals. So I am grounded in all of these values. All of them are very near and dear to me. And all of them, again, standing at the grounding of that, my personal stories I use for the sociological work that I do, and also for transformative change. So when I was talking to Dr. Nota Pridgeon about potentially giving a talk here at Concord, she said, so we're thinking about February. There's 2 dates that would be really great if you could give your talk. The first date was the International Day of Women and Girls in Science, which was last week. And the second date, which Dr. Nota Pridgeon just mentioned a moment ago, was today. So today is February 20th, the World Day of Social Justice, a United Nations commemorative day. And this year's theme, I think, is very fitting with my remarks today. Closing the inequalities gap to achieve social justice. And of course, I cannot think of a more perfect way to discuss the achievements of social justice for Black women in the United States, and also specifically looking at closing the inequalities gap for Black women within the context of higher education. So earlier this week, I was watching an interview with Alicia Garza, who is pictured here. She was giving an interview on the USA Network, and she was talking about the centrality of Black women during Black History Month. And she said something that really stuck with me. She noted that the 2010s, so the decade that we just emerged from, she considered that to be the decade of the Black woman. And when she said that, I thought about it for a moment, and I could not agree with her more. So if you all do not know, Alicia Garza is one of the co-founders of the Black Lives Matter movement. And she did something very ordinary at an extraordinary time. I know that I used to talk about the Black Lives Matter movement a lot in my classes, and I was very struck when students really didn't know about how and why the Black Lives Matter movement began. So I'll take a moment to pause here to share with you that story, and also to cast that against the backdrop of what Garza notes as the decade of the Black woman. So on July 13th, 2013, Alicia Garza was watching TV like many of us. She was watching with her 2 friends, Patrice Cullors and Opal Tometi. They were watching the announcement that George Zimmerman had been acquitted in the murder of Trayvon Martin. As many of you all know, Trayvon Martin, who would have turned, I believe, 25 years old earlier this month, was murdered here in Florida, in Sanford, which is about 70 miles from where I live here in Jacksonville. And he was murdered by George Zimmerman. Trayvon Martin's murder really did shift race relations in this country, and it birthed the Black Lives Matter movement. So Garza was sitting with her 2 friends when she saw the news of Zimmerman's acquittal. She felt hurt, she felt desperate. So she went to Facebook and she posted this: Black people, I love you, I love us, our lives matter, Black lives matter. That post became a movement. Alicia Garza's friend, Patrice Cullors, looked at Alicia's post and created the hashtag Black Lives Matter, and arguably the most significant social movement of our time, of the 21st century, began. And so when Garza made this comment earlier in the week that the decade of the 2010s became the decade of the Black woman, this was a decade in which she and her two friends as Black women birthed this movement. In many ways, I agree. So let's talk more about what happened in that particular decade and thinking about the decade of Black women. In many ways, as I mentioned before, Garza was right. There was suddenly a space, a time, not like the time hadn't existed before, but the way in which the time was happening and how it was unfolding and manifesting was certainly different. So the past decade really did usher in a space for Black women and girls to simply be. We also saw with the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, a different kind of movement, the Black Girl Magic movement. I'm sure that many of you, or all of you in the room, know and understand Black Girl Magic. It was a movement that was also ushered in 2013 by Keyshawn Thompson. She used that concept to talk about and to celebrate the beauty, the power, and the resilience of Black women, and literally it became a movement. Of course, via Twitter as a hashtag, which of course goes viral, but then also as a way in which to personify, celebrate, and empower everyday Black women doing nothing more than just being themselves. And so here, let's take a moment to pause to look at just a sampling of why the decade really was so lit. There were so many wonderful things happening during this time that really did usher in and celebrate so many achievements of Black women. So here are just a few examples. We see the celebration of Black women when it comes to beauty standards. And this actually just happened recently, where you have, at no other point in history, Miss Teen USA, Miss America, Miss USA, and Miss Universe, all women of color, all Black women, and all being and looking at a natural beauty as Black beauty. We see the advancements of Black women in music and pop culture. We see it in movies and media. We saw it for 8 years in the White House. We saw it within higher education as Black women became, or at least it was proffered in 2016 that Black women were at that point attaining college degrees at the highest rate than any other group in the United States. We saw the celebration and the unearthing of Black women's stories as it relates to our history within STEM. We saw bringing Black girls into things like technology via Black Girls Code. And we saw the ushering in and the embracing of Black women's voices in talking politics. And so we saw over the course of this decade, a large number of everyday Black women and more prominent Black women sharing their stories, being authentic, and most importantly, being unapologetic. We also saw the other side of that. And so this shows in 2016, the actor Jesse Williams, who received the Humanitarian Award in 2016 from BET. And during his acceptance speech, which you can see the GIF of here, his acceptance speech was brilliant, and he spent some time dedicating his award to everyday Black women. He spent time talking about how Black women, and more importantly, Black culture, was routinely appropriated, but not adequately appreciated. At the end of his speech, he shows us the flip side of Black Girl Magic, and ends his remarks by saying, gentrifying our genius and then trying us on like costumes before discarding our bodies like rinds of strange fruit. The thing is that just because we're magic does not mean we're not real. And that piece of Williams's speech was the piece that really went viral because it was really speaking to ultimately celebrating this personification of Black womanhood, talking about how it is important to look at and stop and celebrate Black women. But it also provided for us the other side of that, showing that although Black women are doing some amazing things, there are other parts of that reality that we need to be just as invested in talking about and understanding. So let me get real with you for a moment and talk about the other side of that, the real. So being a Black woman and girl in the 21st century, even though it was the decade of the Black woman, there are still so many gender and race disparities and also other aspects of difference and oppression that truly create alarming experiences for Black women and reasons for us to be deeply invested and committed to social justice and change for Black women. And so what I'd like to do is just to briefly provide some examples of some social indicators related to Black women that should very much give us pause. And if anyone's more interested in learning more about this, I have also shared all of my slides with Dr. Netta Pridgeon so she can share out to the larger group for anyone who would like to know more. A lot of these stats and findings came from the status of Black women in the United States, and they reveal some pretty alarming statistics for Black women in a number of ways that impact our quality of life. Even though Black women are gaining ground and earning degrees at higher rates than our Black male counterparts and also some of our female counterparts, there is still work to be done as it relates to earnings, as Black women's earnings are still far less than our Black male counterparts and also our other female counterparts. We take on a lot more debt to get those degrees, which ultimately results in deeper wealth gaps for Black women compared to other people of color in the United States. Black women are dying at much higher rates, after giving birth within a year. So the rates of maternal mortality for Black women are extremely high. Heart disease mortality is extremely high for Black women, as is lung cancer mortality and the presence of AIDS among Black women. City Lab just put out a very interesting study around livability, and they spent some time investigating which cities are the most livable for Black women. And I'm sad to report that the city of Cleveland, Ohio, where I was born and raised, is dead last on the cities that are at least 100,000, that have at least 100,000 residents or more. The city of Cleveland is dead last as being the most livable for Black women, followed by Pittsburgh and Augusta. The city that I live in right now, Jacksonville, Florida, isn't much higher up on the list, showing that there are many major cities in the United States that just are not livable spaces for Black women. Black women continue to face bias as it relates to their hair, something as simple as your hair. Even though we've seen history being made with women of color, particularly those women of color with natural tresses being considered to be the most beautiful in society. There still exists large-scale bias and discrimination of Black women based upon the ways in which they wear their hair, or different ways in which they wear their hair. And I shared a story earlier before my talk in a smaller group about a microaggression experienced by colleagues because of my hair. And I also had to put up on the slide here that just recently at the Oscars, the short film Hair Love received an Oscar about embracing and loving, teaching young Black girls to love their hair, the way in which it grows out of their head. Also, Black women, even though we have the largest political participation and activity, meaning Black women go out to vote at the highest rates, we still face large-scale underrepresentation in political office. Human trafficking is a major concern for women and girls across the nation, regardless of race or ethnicity. However, the human trafficking of Black women and girls is of chief concern. Black women are more likely to face intimate partner violence compared to their other counterparts. Black girls are much more likely to be pushed out of school and criminalized in school. Black women are much more likely to be in prison at much higher rates compared to their other counterparts. And Black girls as young as the age of 6, there's some really interesting studies coming out around Black girls being adultified, meaning treated much older and mistreated as a matter of fact, as young as 6. And as someone who has an 8-year-old, this the findings from this particular study is extremely disturbing. So just because we're magic doesn't mean we're not real. And thinking about the higher education space, the presence of Black women in higher education, I believe needs to be attended to as it relates to social justice. And looking at how we can continue to learn from the outsider within. So as we know, a primary goal of our civil rights legislation was to improve access to education for underrepresented groups. And while access has greatly improved for underrepresented students in the post-civil rights era, the ascension of racial and ethnic minorities into the professoriate, meaning at the faculty ranks, has been a much slower climb. So currently, students of color make up slightly more than 1/3 of the total U.S. college population, yet faculty of color, African American, Hispanic, and Native American professors combined comprise less than 10% of the faculty population in the United States. And this statistic comes from the Chronicle of Higher Education. Many colleges and universities nationwide have attempted to redress this issue with the implementation of strategic diversity initiatives. However, scholars of color, particularly Black women in the academy, remained vastly underrepresented. So Faye Harrison, who is a colleague of mine and an anthropologist, argues that part of the difficulty in transformation within higher education, as she notes, is the fact that not many people recognize racism in the academy as a true problem, but rather something that still exists and demands corrective action. After all, she says, we are in the throes of an era of colorblindness and a post-racial moment marked by ideological and legal assaults against policies such as affirmative action. So I would argue, I would offer that today, that in addition to facing racism, race and racism in the academy, that we must also challenge intersectional racism in the academy, that it's not enough to just challenge race in the academy, that we must be intersectional in our approach. And that means that we must be aware of and recognize how race, gender, class, and other areas of difference creates distinctive disparities, specifically within the academy. So let's talk a little bit about being the outsider within higher education. So in 2010, Black women, as I mentioned earlier, held 66% of all bachelor degrees, and this is a typo, so excuse me, I'm just looking at this now. So Black women held 66% of all bachelor's degrees attained by Black people, and that shouldn't say women, should say Black people. And then 2016, as I mentioned a moment ago, it was that Black women were at that point the most educated group in the United States. There was some concern about that particular statement, that wasn't necessarily the case, but we now know that Black women are attaining bachelor's degrees and higher at the highest rates compared to other points in history. But here's the point. Here's why this is concerning and alarming. While again, on the one side, you've got some magical things about Black women's degree attainment, but then the other part is, again, just because we're magic doesn't mean that we're real. Who's at the head of the class? Look at who's at the head of the class. It's not Black women. So why do we need a social justice platform for Black female faculty? I'm going to tell you why. Because today, Black women comprise just a very small minority of all full-time faculty. So the National Center for Education Statistics noted that in 2016, Black women held just 3%, or 45,000 of the 1.5 million faculty positions in post-secondary institutions. What they also found was that 76% of faculty positions, that's 3 out of 4, 76% of faculty positions, including professors, associate professors, assistant professors, instructors, lecturers, adjunct instructors, and interim professors were held by white men and white women. So 3/4 of the professoriate today is white. Now, while there of course are many reasons to celebrate the recent achievements of Black women in academia, we still face inequities within higher educational institutions. Racism, sexism, and other interlocking oppressions create what Patricia Hill Collins coined the outsider within status for African American women. She was talking specifically about the discipline of sociology, but we can extend that more broadly to higher education, and particularly predominantly white institutions. Routinely, many Black female scholars have to contend with separation anxiety, separating who we are as distinctive individuals from the negative one-dimensional stereotypes and images that have constrained Black womanhood since slavery. These images of Black womanhood deem all Black women, regardless of their education, their status, or their position, as inferior, subservient, hostile, domineering, hypersexual, or overly masculine. And unfortunately, because Black womanhood has long been devalued, Black women's intellectual capacity and production has been deemed inferior. And as such, Black women often face questions of intelligence, competence, legitimacy, and overall fit in doctoral programs or in the professoriate writ large. And unfortunately, Black girl magic hasn't quite made it to the fabric of faculty life and culture. So, what does this look like? What does the real look like within the 21st Century Academy? I talked about some of the stats from the Status of Black Women findings about Black women's lives in general in the U.S. What does that look like in the academy? How does that manifest itself? It manifests itself via race and gender tax, through imposter syndrome, not feeling like you're good enough, having folks question your belonging, or this notion of onlyness, so not loneliness, but onlyness, being an only. Hearing regularly that you don't look like the professor. The struggles with going mean, which actually one of the brilliant students, I believe from Bluefield State, asked me about that earlier. This idea of teaching while Black, so having to deal with a variety of microaggressions from students and also from faculty colleagues while in the actual classroom, conferencing while Black, the expectation of performing at a higher level compared to other faculty counterparts. The vast underrepresentation of Black female faculty in full professorships, so at the highest level you can go as a professor, and also leadership roles like department chair, dean, provost, and ultimately president. That also looks like strained relationships personally and difficulties in maintaining work and life balance. So Deborah Harley wrote a really compelling piece called Maids of Academe, African American Women Faculty at Predominantly White Institutions. And she argued that within the academy, African American women simultaneously assume the roles of scholars, researchers, educators, mentors, service providers, and social change agents. In addition, as African American women faculty members take the journey in the academy and move toward the tenure and promotion process with aspirations for advancement up the hierarchy of supervisory, management, and administrative goals, they are frequently tagged as it or the go-to person for issues of diversity. So in addition to managing all the other things that come along with being a woman of color in the academy, African American female faculty are also have to deal with solving a lot of our institution's diversity problems, which of course only create more tension and more stress as a Black female faculty member. And there's also another added responsibility to that. So Dr. Janome Williamson, who's an associate dean at Concord University, wrote a very compelling piece entitled "The Metaphysical Black Woman, Academic Black Women." And she cautions other Black women in the academy that there is an added responsibility to sharing stories. If you're a Black woman in the academy, she says, whether you're an emerging scholar or full professor, understand that there is an enhanced responsibility for us as Black women to share our truths, share our stories, demystify the academic process, support each other, supplement and perhaps shape the experiences of Black women who are and will become academics. So I mentioned at the top of my talk how this notion of her story, so sharing my story as a personal experience, becoming a political transformative act is so important. And so why is talking and storytelling such important acts if you were a Black woman? So feminist scholar Bell Hooks argues that for the oppressed, power originates in moving from silence into speech. Patricia Hill Collins adds that when Black women come out of silence, they simultaneously come into voice and power. And so for academic women of color, speaking up is an empowering act of resistance and enrichment, and more importantly, having a keen awareness of women in academia is critical in ensuring the presence and growth of women faculty of color in the 21st century and on into the future. So I'd like to spend the last portion of my remarks talking about my 10 years as a faculty member. And I'll just say that as my slide is titled, that my decade wasn't so magical. So I was a faculty member from 2008 to 2018 and was awarded a tenure and promotion to associate professor in 2014. I was the only African American faculty member in my department of 20 plus full-time faculty members. When I started my assistant professorship in the fall of 2008, I was the only underrepresented person of color. So in addition to being the only Black faculty member, I was the only person of color. Overall, I had a very successful career at my university. I was engaged in a very heavy amount of what I consider diversity working and doing lots of dissertation advising. I sat on tons of committees. I led our President's Commission on Diversity and Inclusion. I was heavily involved in the recruitment of new faculty and the retention of junior faculty. I served as a mentor and advisor for many students and also for junior faculty. I established very strong relationships with my students and my colleagues and had a reputation for being a very passionate scholar who was committed to issues of diversity and inclusion. I very much embodied the intersections of my social identity in my work. So I lived, breathed, everything about who I was. I was very unapologetic and living my authentic self. And brought that to bear with me to work every day. It all overlapped. I also spent a significant time establishing myself and a brand as a national expert on issues of race and gender diversity. And from about 2013 to 2018, I had about 150 different media placements in international, national, regional, and local outlets. I was ensuring that my voice as a scholar was known and that I was leading the pack, if you will, as a thought leader in my particular space. So while I experienced professional success at my institution, I also worked very hard to counter negative experiences and preconceived notions others held about Black people, and especially about Black women. And these broader negative representations, which I've talked about already, definitely influenced how my students and my colleagues viewed me. In spite of being successful, I spent a lot of time struggling with feelings of being isolated, marginalized, questioning my fit, questioning my worth, my legitimacy, and also having other people question that as well on a regular basis. I actually spent in 2016 or 2017, 2017, 2018, can't remember. I gave a TED Talk about a very brief encounter I had with a colleague. And while I'm not gonna show my TED Talk, you're more than welcome to look at it later, or not. I would like to share with you an interaction I had with a colleague before I wrap up my talk. So as I mentioned, I started my faculty position in the fall of 2008. That was an election year, if you can recall. And on election night in 2008, I was invited to attend a gathering at a colleague's house to watch the return of the vote. I was very apprehensive about attending this get-together because I was still new to the university and did not know very many people outside of work. However, I recognized the importance of building social capital and fitting in. So there was an informal rule that you have to make efforts to socialize with colleagues occasionally outside of work in order to be seen as friendly, credible, and to be liked by your colleagues. So when I arrived at my colleague's house that evening, I took the opportunity to meet and network with some of my new colleagues. And in doing so, I struck up a conversation with another professor, an older white faculty member in another department. I introduced myself to him and mentioned to him that I was in the sociology department. Although I did not explicitly identify myself as a professor or new to the university, I essentially assumed that he knew that I was one of a faculty member, given that the majority of the individuals at the party that evening were fellow faculty. So we chatted, exchanged pleasantries for a few minutes about work when the election results came in. It was announced that Barack Obama had won the election, making him the first Black president in the United States. Naturally, I was overjoyed, and so was everyone at the party, including the gentleman that I was conversing with. However, I was completely blindsided by what he said to me next. So he leaned in close to me, he shook his finger at me, and he whispered, "No more excuses. Obama is the president now," he continued, "so no more excuses. Get your education. Tell your brothers, your cousins, everyone you know to go and get an education. You have no more excuses now." Of course, I was stunned. I could not believe that this man, whom I had casually been chatting with for 15 minutes, did not realize that I was a professor, that I was a PhD just like he was. How could he assume that I did not have an education? Why did he further assume that everyone in my family, my brother, my cousins, everyone I knew needed to run to go out and get one too? And why couldn't he tell that I was just like him? As a new faculty member, especially as a young Black female, I did not have the voice and the space to tell my colleague that he was an idiot, because he was. I was so hurt by his words that I politely excused myself and I went home. Over the next few days, I thought pointedly more and more about what this colleague had said to me. And I made the decision that if I wanted to be successful at my university and in my life for that matter, that I would just put the incident behind me. And over the next 10 years at my university, I saw the same professor many times on campus, but he never remembered me and he never once said hello. So, troubling success. There are a number of things that happened as a result of that particular experience. And these kinds of racialized incidents are very common of my educational experience since I was an undergraduate student. And as a faculty member, those kinds of issues followed me into the classroom and ultimately impacted my interactions with students, white and minority alike. This led to a number of implications for me, physical, emotional, and professional implications, feeling service fatigue, post-tenure conflict, being trapped with feelings of perfectionism. Unfortunately, there was no infrastructure in place to reward the significant service overload that I was experiencing and locally participating in. I ultimately wrote an open letter to my university in 2014, which was the same exact time that I was going up for tenure. And ultimately, I made the decision to vacate my tenured position in 2018. And I'm currently on what I am terming a Black academic detox from the academy. And I will be writing more about this detoxing experience in an upcoming book that will come out at the beginning of next year. I am going to pause there. I literally have about 12 more slides to go, but I know that I'm running out of time and I don't want to end without giving some opportunity for reflection and commentary on my remarks. The rest of my slides are related to implications for policy, practice, and social justice within higher education. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and open it up for questions and or comments on what I've discussed.
Love to have questions. If you'd like to step on up here so you can talk a little bit to Dr. Wilder so she can hear you, you can do that. If you would like to just say it and I can kind of share. Questions for Dr. Wilder? Would you like to step on up?
You don't mind?
Yeah, of course. And if you come up this way, it's a little awkward, but if you come up here a little bit, she'll be able to hear you and see you a little bit better.
First of all, thank you for being here. This is really odd. I'm a broadcasting student, and I'm looking into culture of different spaces. Do you feel like certain, this is going to be very awkward for me to say, as a woman and a Black woman at that, is there like a place in the country you don't feel welcome? Like back in the day when Black people were marginalized in the South, is there any place in the United States that you feel like women should not be, well, my apologies, would feel against going there? I feel like they don't have problems.
Can I just step in and kind of, for everybody here so that so you have a chance to hear his question. I think part of what you're asking is, are there any areas in the country where maybe Black women don't feel safe?
Yes, that's it.
Yeah.
I'm very nervous.
Yeah.
Oh,
That's all right. Yeah.
No worries. I thank you for your question. I know it takes courage to get up and walk toward what I'm sure you're not looking at, like my screen or whatever. So I really appreciate you coming to hear my lecture, and thank you for your question. So as a woman, I'm always thinking about my safety. And I think when it comes to like thinking about the threat of violence and just safety in general, I don't think about myself primarily as a Black woman first. When it comes to that, I kind of think about like my safety as a woman. So I was talking about the livability studies and how my hometown is like the worst place or the least livable place for Black women. I do think about places in the U.S. that aren't as receptive and as welcome environments like in a workplace environment. But I do think that part of the difficulty right now is that, particularly in the South, right, being polite is part of the culture, right? So you really don't have a good sense of where you can feel safe, right? In the context of your question, because, you know, most people are really, really polite. You know, so I don't personally on a regular basis think about my safety in the context of a Black woman. I think more about my safety, like, okay, should I be this place at a certain time at night by myself? I think about that. But I don't necessarily think about that primarily as a Black woman. Yes, I do think that there are spaces where Black women are very, very unsafe. But unfortunately, and this is the case for all women, the spaces in which we are the most unsafe are with our partners at home, right? When it comes to physical violence and domestic violence. So I hope that somewhat answers your question.
Oh, yes, thank you.
It's also been kind of interesting from kind of our perspective because I think we're in a much more rural setting. And then we're also in a state that remains to get just about the worst stereotypes that you can get when it comes to openness and inclusiveness, which is a real disservice to this area, I have to say. From being here and just from seeing, you know, you folks here today, wow, they got it wrong. They have it so wrong. And so, you know, I'm really thankful that you've been able to be here to kind of give us the opportunity to make that statement that people are very, very wrong about this place in a lot of ways.
So I will say, when my parents retired, they left Cleveland and went to Mississippi. So my parents live in Mississippi now, and I feel like every time I go to Mississippi, it's a time warp. I don't necessarily feel unsafe, but I do feel more on guard when it comes to potentially experiencing racialized things.
And I think that's also probably something that, you know, you have to keep in mind when it comes to safety and activism. That's another thing for you to really kind of have to consider is where you are and who you are.
Yes.
I got a question.
Yeah, please, come on up.
It's probably not related to, well, it's kind of is. All right, so when you found out that Obama had won the election and the guy had said what he said to you, how did you hold your tongue? Because, you know, being that, okay, my mother is a strong Black woman, and if some type of remark would have happened like that, I'm pretty sure things wouldn't have went down the way you handled it. So how did you hold your tongue and keep everything under control?
I really wanted to pop off, but I have to tell you, I was very surprised. I was just like, what? I mean, I was just really, he caught me so off guard that I could not have. And then the other thing too, I was a new professor. You know, the last thing you want to do is come across as an angry Black woman. This is the place where I have to get tenure. There's so many things that I was kind of like trying to deal with all in those like microseconds of all of this happening. So for me, and it's kind of like me as a person in general, the best way that I know how to manage things, emotions, is to like just, you know, disengage from stuff. So I got up and I left because I felt like if I continued to be in that space, sharing space with him, then I probably would have said something or I would have took the mask off. I will say that as the 10 years progressed, I got a lot more comfortable in my skin as a person, as a faculty member. I felt really on guard. Like I felt like I couldn't wear my hair in certain hairstyles, or I couldn't say certain things. I was very just overly policing myself and my actions so much in my earlier years that after a while I was like, you know what, I'm gonna just be who I am. Although, like, had that been 2018 as opposed to 2008, I don't know if I would have. I probably would have stayed there and been like, so can you explain to me why you think I need an education, you know? But then also, like, why should we have to feel like we have to explain away ourselves all the time? You know, we shouldn't have to be put on the defense all the time. Let me explain to you why I belong in this space with you. You know, that should be a given. So I think had I if I had a do-over, I probably would have just left, right? I did regret going to, and then the funny thing is when I confronted the person who was hosting the party and told her what happened, this was years later, she was like, oh, he's probably had too much to drink. Oh, okay. So, I don't know if it would have made a difference anyway.
All right, thank you.
Dr. Wilder, one of the things that these questions and that your discussion, I think, brings up for me, from my perspective, is how much I'm hearing about how white professionals can use our white privilege to help in some of these situations. And so I think, to me, it's like just keep trying to listen, but I think, trying to act as an ally in a lot of those situations is especially important for professionals who, we may not have these same experiences, but I think we have almost more of a responsibility to try to provide those spaces for folks and to try to make sure that those guys aren't at the party. And so I think that's another really important thing for us to all remember. The things that Dr. Wilder is talking about, she's talking about these things from her perspective as a Black female professional, but these are things that are all of our responsibilities. And I think the more that we all can listen and understand, I think the better that's going to make academia as a whole, and the better a learning environment that's going to make for all of us. Are there any other questions?
I have a question.
Please.
Okay, so my question is, what encourages you to continue in a society riddled with systematic oppression? Because sometimes I wonder if getting an education will ultimately mean anything, especially when people are being denied employment because of their race.
You have a valid point. And quite frankly, I started, I think back in 2016, I started teaching a course called Professional Development for Sociology Majors. And it was for juniors and seniors who are getting ready to graduate. And it was a very practical life skills class. We talked about credit scores and putting a resume together and finding a job on Indeed and, just all these different things. And part of that conversation was figuring out whether it was worth it to keep going. Is it worth it to get an advanced degree in a field that is, the starting salary may not be enough to sustain the kind of lifestyle as you want? Is it worth spending so much time on pursuing a graduate or doctoral degree when that Black women are paid 62 cents to the dollar, compared to white men, right? I think that's an excellent question. And I think, as I was saying in the smaller group, that you can activate the power that you have right now. You don't necessarily need a piece of paper to do that. And I think that a lot of younger people are starting to realize the value in, kind of stopping, right? We pushed education, and we did for so long. Education, keep going, keep going, keep going. But I think we're starting to ask the question that you're asking at what cost, right? Or what's the point, or what's the value of getting all this education to go into an environment that's toxic that you're going to have to leave anyway, right? So, you're asking a really great question, and I think these are really important yet personal questions for each individual to dig deep and to answer. What keeps me going is that I know this is my purpose. Like, I don't have a choice. This is like what I'm supposed to be doing. So I keep persevering in spite of.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
No, I bet.
Yeah, for sure.
I wanted to piggyback on the question. So being like what she said, once you get that paper, it's like you might think everything changes, but a lot, especially where I'm from, most people, or if they do go to college and get that degree, they come back to do the same thing if they didn't go to college, if that makes sense. And I want to know why is that? Like, why do people go to try to change the outcome of their future, but continue to do the same thing as if they didn't go to college?
Yeah, so let me provide a sociological explanation to that, right? Because we provide messages in our society that say that, that we place such a value on education, right? And especially when we're thinking about Black folks, I remember one of the things that my mom probably said so much when I was growing up to me and my sister was, you need to make sure that you can get an education so you don't have to depend on a man, right? I mean, she said that over and over and over, and it made us like uber independent. To a fault, right? I gotta like undo some of that stuff now because it's hard for me to like ask for help. So I think we get so many messages saying that education is important. More degrees you have, the better. But what we're realizing is that, the value of a bachelor's degree today in 2020 is not the same as it was in 2000. Certainly not the same as in 1980, right? And you have a lot of trades and skilled work that you can do that you spend a lot less time, a lot less money, you get out and end up making just as much or more money had you earned a degree in something else. Not saying that you shouldn't go to school and get your paper. If that's what you're passionate about and that's your purpose, do it. But, you have to contend with the value of a certain degree and then, if jobs are available. Also, something I had to deal with too is, I downplay my degree as much as possible. I don't tell people unless it comes out. Like if I'm in a work environment, yes, but like just in my everyday life, like I don't tell people I have a degree because then people tend to think, a PhD degree, because then people think what? And what do you think people think about Black women with PhDs? What's that? Uppity, bougie. Oh, you think you're better than everybody else?
Well,
Man.
It's crazy that you say that because it's like, if I was in your shoes, I'm gonna show it off. I done worked all these years to have that, so might as well show it off. But I appreciate like how humble you are with it, but at the same time, I guess we just two different people because I definitely show mine off. Like I'm gonna be the first person in my family.
Well, and I think for me too, it's come at a, like I said, at a price.
Yeah.
And feel like people that you're amongst PhDs and they're not treating you like you're one, you belong. And then, you're treated differently by people who don't have them. So it's a careful balance. I am a humble person by nature, but I don't want anyone to think that, I'm, uppity or better than you because I have a degree. I learned from you just like you learned from me,
I'll stay up and keep tight.
Thank you. Well, anybody else? Okay, let's have one more comment, and then what we can do is kind of open it up afterwards. Let's talk first.
Hey again.
Hi.
So I guess I have a question. Throughout the entire conversation, you mentioned one thing that caught my ear a few times was being your authentic self. I guess my question to you is how you kind of found that voice into being your authentic self rather than being in situations where you felt you had a code switch and where you said that you felt uncomfortable doing your hair a certain way or this, that, and the next thing. Did that just come with time or how did you really get into that?
Yeah, it just became a part of the journey, a part of my journey, trial and error, realizing that regardless of how polite I tried to be or how white, well, that's a strong word because I wasn't really out there trying to be white. But I felt that, it's funny that you mentioned code switch. I code switch a lot in my classes. I started to do that a lot more because that's just how I naturally am, right? And being a lot softer, right? The literature even talks about Black women as being hard, and just me as a natural person softening up definitely helped me. But it's just something that I've learned over the course of 43 years, and just being who I am and being okay with that. Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, I think what we'll do is just kind of go ahead and thank Dr. Wilder so much for being here today, and kind of just go ahead and close things up. But I do think that, Dr. Wilder's email is widely available, which I'm happy to share if that's all right with you.
Yes, and Dr. Nevill-Pridgen, if I could just say, I feel really badly for not being able to like complete my presentation because, like I said, I've stopped at slide 18. I think I have 29. So please, if folks would like the rest of the talk, please feel free to access it. Please feel free to email me with questions, follow up. I'm more than happy to start a dialogue and to continue that for sure.
Well, thank you so much for being here today. Thank you so much to all of you for coming. We very much appreciate you being here. You'll be able to access the recording of the talk on the Concord YouTube page. But what we'll also do is I'll have information, any additional information. If you want to get in contact with Dr. Wilder, you can get in touch with me, Katie Pridgen, so you can just find me at all the Concord stuff. And so I'll also find a place where we can kind of put up some additional information about how to contact Dr. Wilder in the future. Okay. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it.
She still got time? You got time?
Just come on up here for just a second, because I don't think you had a chance to attend the earlier session. And so why don't you just kind of tell her your name, and then that way she'll